And the way I found out about this was there was a student at the university who was a PhD candidate in history, and he had access to LBJ's papers. And we were attending a cocktail party before a gala for the arts that was given by Governor Connolly in about 1968, I believe it was. And this guy had introduced himself to me as a PhD candidate in history who was specializing on the Treaty of Versailles. So I said, you might be able to answer a question for me. I've heard about a document that I've heard was a hoax. And he said, what document is that? And I said, Morgenthau's pastoral policy. And he smiled and he said, would you come? You got a few minutes? And I said, yes, I guess so. He says, come with me. So he smartly walks out of the building we're in and goes into the main building, takes me up to, I think, maybe the 4th floor or something like that. Walks in, he opens a vault, and he says, are your hands clean? He says, dust off your hands, make sure your hands clean. And he goes in and he brings out this document. He says, hold out your hands, and he handed it to me, and it was the document. It was stamped by the Versailles Committee. It was signed by President Woodrow Wilson, and it stated exactly what I had heard. I think the problem with this document, the reason it was called a hoax, is no one knew where it was. If you don't know where a document is, you can't find it.
Right.
And this document probably would have been classified if they'd had a classification system in 1919. However, it did state that the purpose, one of the proposals, the proposal made to the Versailles Committee and introduced by President Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, which was authored by Hans Morgenthau Sr., it was called Morgenthau's pastoral policy because it stated that the Germans should be exterminated under the Treaty of Versailles because they're an inherently warlike race, and that Germany should be reduced to a pasture land. And that was pretty drastic. Imagine what somebody would think if they found out about that. Imagine what kind of results that could have.
That's controversial in itself, the story you just told. However, there's something even bigger as far as a stalemate that you talk about at the end of World War II. Now, in the books I read, we won World War II. You have a differing opinion about that, and it has something to do with submarines and missiles.
That stalemate was brought to my attention in the same set of documents that this Treaty of Versailles came out of, which was LBJ's papers. These papers are in the LBJ School of Public Service and the Sid W. Richardson Research Center, which were created by Lyndon Johnson. And at the time that I found out about these, they were being stored in the main building until these buildings that were eventually built at the University of Texas were completed. And these PhD candidates had access to these papers, and these papers were presidential papers, so they weren't classified, although they definitely would be if the intelligence community had had anything to do with it. However, there were these papers, and these graduate students had access to them. And this graduate student saw the whole scenario that described the end of World War II, and it involved the Germans sending 24 special U-boats carrying rockets with nuclear warheads, neutron bomb warheads, and they surrounded the country and basically blackmailed the country into signing or agreeing to a certain end of the war, which is different from what we're told. It wasn't unconditional. Yes.
Settlements.
It was a negotiated settlement, and the Germans, by the time they got these subs in position and the rockets ready to fire, the Russians were already overrunning Germany. So it was so late in the war, and at that point, if they'd used the missiles on the United States, they could have bombed us and done a lot of damage, but they wouldn't have been able to even go back to Germany, because by that time the Russians would have it. They would have everything.
A lot of people are under the opinion that Hitler's nuclear program was neglected, that Hitler himself had no respect for it, that he called it Jewish physics, that he was not interested in nuclear weapons. And the other thing I think a lot of people need to understand is when we talk about nuclear weapons, we're not, a lot of people have the vision of the H-bomb in their mind, the mushroom clouds and things like that. That isn't necessarily what they were shooting for. They were shooting for a quick, dirty type of radioactive weapon. You mentioned the term red mercury.
Well, that was a clean bomb. The red mercury bomb, the neutron bomb, is a clean bomb, you see. And in late 1944, Goebbels called Werner Heisenberg, and he said, how close are you to getting a bomb that we can use on New York City? And how big will it have to be? And he said, it would take a bomb about the size of a baseball to do damage to New York City.
He was confident enough at that time to make
Yes.
that claim?
Yes, and he said, you can tell the Fuhrer that we'll have a basketball for him at Christmas. And so there you've got a neutron bomb. And the thing that corroborated this for me was in approximately 1961, when I was working for Union Oil Company of California. I worked with an engineer from Roswell named Dave Dunn. And during the war, Dave was the commandant of the POW camp in Roswell, and where the prisoners of Rommel's Afrika Korps were brought. And the prisoners had postcards with them, which showed New York City being nuked. It was a nuclear weapon. You could tell the cloud was a nuclear cloud, and the photograph was a composite of two photographs, and they were halftones made by Hitler's, or rather Rommel's, field lithographers while they were in North Africa as a morale builder. And what they'd done is they'd taken a picture of their neutron bomb tests, which they did on the Libyan desert, which is why they were down there in the first place. They took a photograph of the neutron bomb explosion and a photograph of New York City, and they superimposed, they put these things together in a montage to show New York City being hit by this nuclear weapon.
I think people would be a little traumatized to think that somehow the end of World War II ended differently than most people have been taught.
Well, it's a peculiar thing. I mean, it's a peculiar thing that people have this understanding that the Germans were just out to kill everybody in sight, and that they would have used a weapon if they'd had it. That's not necessarily true, because they had many opportunities to do much more damage than they did and didn't. So it all depends on a lot of peculiar circumstances. After all, you had a leader, Hitler, who was guided by astrology. You know, if the stars weren't right that month or that year or that day, it would influence everything.
So you feel that might have played into some of his decision-making or lack thereof?
It probably did. After all, you had one of the top leaders, Hess, who took off in an airplane and flew to England thinking he was going to convince the English to join with Germany against Russia.
And that would be a bit delusional, wouldn't it?
And, you know, he actually believed he could do it. And he had good reason to believe that there was plenty of influence in England, and believe me, there was plenty of influence in England along that direction. But Churchill wouldn't have it.
Now, I think a lot of people would be comforted by the fact that if you were the only one that was making these outrageous claims about stalemates with nuclear weapons launched from submarines,
Yes.
maybe they would like to pick this up at their nearest Borders bookstore. Actually, this was printed in 1995. It's called Vengeance, Hitler's Nuclear Weapon, Fact or Fiction. This individual states in the inside of the cover here, from 1943 onwards, Hitler and the Nazi propaganda machine poured forth a torrent of warnings to the Allies about a miracle weapon. This book reveals that far more lethal vengeance weapons existed, not as a wild fantasy of Hitler's imagination, but a form of a cargo of highly radioactive material carried in a modified V-2 rocket designed to be launched from special sites in France. These deadly rockets had the potential to turn Britain into a radioactive wasteland.